Hello everyone, and today I wanted to talk to you about something completely different. I have chosen the three biggest obstacles in my life, the three biggest addictions, and there were many more besides these three. I'm talking here about alcohol, drugs, and gambling. How it affected me, how it started to function in my life, and what it looks like today. And now, let's start from the very beginning. I think I'll start with alcohol, how it began, how it affected me, and so on. It appeared already in my youngest years, starting at the age of 16 years old. Somewhere in secret, I started sneaking drinks. It was one beer, half a beer, and so on. And that's how it started. Now, at the beginning, it was pleasant, nice, just to relax. Then came a later time as I entered adulthood. That's when it started what began to drag me down. Alcohol was no longer just a simple way to help me relax. It eventually helped me to completely stop thinking about myself and my life. It helped me get through the day. It helped me in such a way that it hid my true self. Once inside, there was that poor young boy who was desperately crying out for help, but who unfortunately just couldn't find a way to get out of there, whom I had hidden somewhere deep inside. Instead, another person appeared, a second face. And I remember it so clearly, often, almost always in the early morning. When I first got up, I would look at myself in the mirror and say to myself, while I was still completely sober, "Why are you here? What are you living for? I can't stand to look at you, you piece of trash. You don't deserve to be here." Then it was a quick trip to the fridge, another glass, another bottle, and that's how it was. I can count myself among the group of high-functioning alcoholics, and that's what my therapist said as well. Everything seemed normal. Hidden alcoholism. It quite often happened that I would drive my partner all the way to work, then come back home alone and just sit down to drink some amount of alcohol, give myself time because I knew my body, I knew it could evaporate, measure the level of content, check if I could already go pick her up from work again. So that's how it went. No one knew anything and I hid it very carefully. What does that mean? There are all sorts of different behavioral patterns. Lying, cheating, betrayals, and so on and so on. That was part of my life. Toxic me, toxic behaviors. I think that many of you are somewhere on this path or heading in that direction, not seeing the problem. It might be that someone listens to this and they will understand certain things. It's not about teaching you, but also about showing the truth. And the truth is that as a man, I was afraid to talk about it. I was afraid to show the world how things really were. I was afraid of solving problems. I created many of them, but I couldn't get through them. Of course, the consequences came with time later on. Alcohol helped me feel like I was actually somebody important. I felt almost like God himself. It gave me wings and it gave me a massive surge of confidence. I had absolutely no trouble connecting with other people, and I wasn't ashamed of myself at all, at least up to a certain point, because the heavy guilt just kept piling up inside of me. More and more, it was screaming loudly in my head, and I simply had to deceive it with something. I had to silence it somehow. And alcohol, no matter how you look at it, was with me for a very long time. So what comes with that? Certainly during that specific period of time, during that, let's call it, long and difficult journey with alcohol, something else entirely unexpected appeared as well, something that sealed my downfall. Gambling, right? Somewhere there, the first times. playing cards with friends, just a regular game, nothing significant, but then money started to appear. That provided me with a massive rush of adrenaline. It gave me a profound sense of absolute superiority, a feeling that I was winning, and so on. That also pulled me over to the shadowy and dark side of the moon, that deep dark side that was already living inside me, that was beginning to slowly sprout, to take root, and to bear its bitter fruit. It began to produce forbidden fruit. Yes, that's exactly how it looked. Yes, that's exactly how it was. That going to the casino for the first time, feeling that atmosphere, that adrenaline that was present there, I also gave into it. And I gave into it so much that I gradually began to win more and more. That intense and overwhelming frenzy that appeared there, that incredible feeling of pure excitement. As a person, he was very addicted to it, how right after work he would rush to go play. But what also comes with it are consequences, because gambling is not only about winning, but also about losing. And yes, looking at it and calculating, I lost more times than I won. But in order to successfully acquire the necessary funds, first you had to seek out loans from various individuals, then you had to utilize formal banking institutions, and in the end, you had to depend heavily upon the so-called assistance of people who lent money at extremely high interest rates. But it's not like you can win something every time to pay something back. Of course, there were wins, and those were, for that time, very big wins. Converted to today's money, let's say, it was about 60 to 70,000. That was a lot of money. A lot of money to fulfill your dreams, to run to the store for a moment, buy yourself something new, buy something new for someone else, justify a pleasure for someone. Except that this pleasure came at a cost later. Because being in a relationship with someone, showing and doing such things, that person didn't realize it. Such behaviors didn't just weigh on me, they also weighed on those close to me. People who they were completely devoted to me with all their heart, these people who placed their absolute trust in me, and I felt like I was slowly destroying all of that in some way. I was systematically destroying it in some inexplicable way, and exactly, here again, we're going back to the past. Today, with the perspective of time, I can look at my life completely objectively and see things and see the harm. It's also true that we can't rebuild bridges, we can't rebuild what a person has destroyed. Gambling? Exactly. Once again, it is yet another overwhelming addiction, another exhausting emotional roller coaster, and yet another deeply painful humiliation for everyone involved. You know what comes with that too? Between the first, second, and third, drugs appeared. Yes, amphetamines and cocaine showed up. Sometimes there was marijuana. When combined with those first two successful projects, it really turned out to be an absolutely massive and incredible success for me personally. Like a booster, so to speak, that completed everything. Masking one with the other. It's like this when you're dealing with an addict. At the beginning, I remember I would take 200 milliliters of alcohol. For the last year, I was drinking between 1.5 to 2 liters of alcohol a day. I was drunk all the time. It's just that my body became addicted to it. And once it got addicted, I had to boost it with something else. Spice it up so I could feel better. So that's when drugs came into the picture. Something new. In fact, it only really appeared in my life when he appears to be roughly about 38 to 40 years old at this time. It wasn't as long a story as with alcohol, but it also had an impact. It affected me, it affected my relationships, it affected people. on creating something, this image of a person that I wasn't, on creating such a fabrication. Today I can talk about it without regret. Maybe not without regret, maybe it's without guilt. Today I can talk about it openly. Today I can answer questions where I am able to sit here in front of you and talk about it. In the past, I would have had a problem admitting that I was a drug addict, a gambler, or an alcoholic, because that really wasn't the case. At that time, I didn't see that truth. Others saw it, the people around me saw it, and even though many times someone tried to help me, I rejected that help. You can't help someone who doesn't want it. And the people who were with me became codependent. Because my gambling and my behavior, which was very manipulative and very toxic, affected those people, I was able to turn my own fault into a win. Convince someone that it was someone else's fault. Why did I drink? Because I felt bad, because you said something to me, or because she said something? Because it was easier. It was easier and didn't need any explanation. It was easier for me to attack. Of course, there were times when I bowed my head, there were apologies. It has happened countless times, over and over again. The phrase "I'm sorry" is just a brief and fleeting momentary sentence, used as if to soothe and settle someone's turbulent emotions, to show that, well, I have truly changed, and that I am fully capable of fixing all of this. But did that really happen? Absolutely not. Today I look at people around me, people who show up here and there, and I see people with similar problems, with issues they can't handle, and they escape into things like that. You know, there are a lot of such addictions, often escaping into work, one of mine as well. Is it worth it? Absolutely not. One thing I know for sure is that today, looking back, I saw what life is like, how it looks, and what kind of impact it has. You know, one could talk about why it was like that. We would have to go back to childhood and so on. What caused it for us, why it was like that. But I think we'll be able to come back to that in the next part. What I want to tell you is that it's worth admitting the truth to yourself. It's worth looking at yourself in the mirror. Seems so simple, yet at the same time so difficult. To look at yourself and see the truth, to tell yourself the truth straight to your own eyes. And then, if it's possible, there is such a possibility. Take advantage of help if you need it. There is plenty of professional help around. I'm not here to teach you anything. This is just to show a certain perspective, that of one guy, how he behaved, how it all worked. But I think you'll see a lot of similar behaviors in your own surroundings, among your loved ones, among your friends. Often somewhere out there, you hide behind fear, afraid that someone might see, afraid that you might lose someone. Trust me, it's not worth it to lose yourself for someone else. Because if someone doesn't want help, you can't force them in any way. And it's like, whether it's threats or pleas, a person can end up at rock bottom. A person can't, doesn't have to, but might lose their home, lose their job, and really end up under a bridge. Only at that moment do I think it was a good moment for me, when life gave me a real kick. And that allowed me to start changing something. Of course, even after that change, I still made mistakes more than once, and I will continue to make them. But today I am aware of the consequences of what I do, and above all, I am not afraid of it, and not afraid of the truth about myself. That's why you should be careful, because it's worth it. Addictions are such that they can deceive you very quickly. I know it's hard to take someone's word for it until you face it yourself, until you realize you have a problem with it. I fought this within myself, and thanks to that I'm here and able to talk about it. I'm glad you listened to my story. I'm glad you're here and watching this. Perhaps someone will listen closely to what I've discussed here today and change their own path. Now, I wanted to tell you a bit more about myself. Exactly, this is yet another tragic part of a man's personal story that completely and utterly destroyed his entire life. This is the part of the story that made me fall to my knees. Where did it come from? Really? Leaving my childhood family home? For the very first time. I could honestly say that I was already deeply damaged. Yes, I suppose I wasn't ever really taught what the real world should actually look like without all those lies, based on everything I knew back then. Something that didn't exist. It showed that I felt the way I felt. Well, if as a young child you are constantly being told that you are completely worthless, that you are just a nobody, and so on and so forth, a child starts to think that way. And that's exactly what happened in my case. That's what happened to me. That's how it started. As I actually thought, as I mentioned earlier, this is quite possibly the single most, so to speak, deeply distressing and agonizing chapter of my entire life, which profoundly shaped and influenced every aspect of all of this. But it's also the part that shaped me at that time. It's also the part that pushed me towards such and not other behaviors. And it was that very experience that showed me exactly how weak I truly am and what a pathetic coward I have been. And it continued on in that way, simply because I found that I just couldn't stand up to it at all. Because that's simply what I was shown. A quiet boy, hidden somewhere in the corner, running away. Books. Because that was the only form of escape at that time. It was the only form that was available to me. And then life showed me that it could be done completely differently. Books faded into the background. Of course, they still appeared, but friends showed up, alcohol appeared, and over time other addictions emerged. Somewhere, of course, as I mentioned, they would appear. Amazing people and so on. But was I able to do anything about it? To form something deeper? If I myself was twisted and warped? Well, unfortunately not. So how was I supposed to function? You know, you could look at it from another perspective. Well, yes, as an adult man, yes, after all, I had a brain, I could think, but for me it was easier not to think. For me it was just easier to go into something that helps me, and that's what I thought back then. It was something that was actually dragging me down. No matter how much I tried, those efforts weren't for me. Those efforts were for other people, to show them what I was like. Fantastic, so that to gain their approval, so that it wouldn't be noticed. Back in those days, I could best describe myself as a clumsy clown performing in a chaotic circus. I spent many times intentionally making a complete fool of myself, constantly being that incredibly loud and boisterous person at every party, and always desperately showing off my funny side to anyone who would watch. Really. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, noticing comments and so on being pointed at. There is always that one incredibly loud person, perhaps at a professional meeting or a crowded social party, the one who constantly makes a great deal of noise around themselves, but that noise is entirely artificial. In reality, all of that commotion was actually a desperate cry, a profound cry for help, but unfortunately it was one that absolutely no one saw. Even if someone asked, whether everything was all right with me, if everything was okay, or if I needed any help, or that I had a problem. At that moment, my reaction was completely different, almost aggressive. That also appeared. It wasn't necessarily physical violence, but more a kind of abuse. Psychological violence, emotional violence. There was a lot of that. There was quite a significant amount of that happening as I finally left my home as a victim and gradually began the process of turning into an aggressor. I slowly began to reveal the more sinister and dark side of myself. Jealousy, pathological jealousy. Sometimes really stories were just made up for no reason at all, just because, for example, someone smiled nicely at me, someone thanked me for something, and so on. That's how it was. That's how it was, and today I can finally reflect upon it from a significant distance. Today I can look back and see the intricate details of what my life used to be like. But most importantly, I can look at it with a fresh mind, with a profound sense of newfound self-awareness, and with that young boy inside who no longer has to cry out for help, but who is finally being heard. And I can truly see, for the first time, what a simple, peaceful, and uncomplicated life can actually look like. Because is it really worth cluttering it up with some nonsense? No, but you have to get to a certain point to understand it. Because if I wouldn't understand it and you won't understand it, you'll find yourself at a point where maybe you will have had enough. Look at how much it is now. Those tragic people who were simply unable to cope with their struggles and who ultimately took their own lives. And especially the number when it comes to young people has increased very drastically in recent years. We need to talk about it. We need to speak up, not be afraid to raise our voices. I know what comes with it, the wave of criticism that will arise and so on, that someone won't like something and things like that. But should I care about that? Well, no. You see, that's also connected to all of this, that my own practice, so to speak. I will always try, and I do try to translate that into theory. I see my light at the end of the tunnel. And during this time, when certain things have changed, addiction is no longer my God, in quotation marks, that also shows me that people out there are listening to what I say. Many times we've met on live streams and you listened to what I was saying, you participated very actively. In these conversations, there wasn't a monologue. All kinds of questions were asked, this or that, about the past, whether it still affects me, and so on as of today. Is it worth going back to the past? In my case, it was worth it. But most importantly in all of this, once I matured enough to make the decision that I could change something, and that actually happened in a single day. One day I realized that I had to change something, and that's how it started. I could have paid for it with my life. Absolutely, yes. This happened because my physical body had become far too dependent on those harmful substances. However, I decided to quit everything entirely in a single day. Just like that. Then I think it was the best decision of my life. I would like to start by saying thank you so much for watching me today. Now I'd like to talk about a slightly different topic, specifically about several complex and deep-seated emotions that have been consistently present throughout the majority of my life's journey. Emotions that were supposed to have existed in my life, but which I found myself unable to express, which I was never able to show, which remained hidden somewhere deep within the recesses of my heart. Life overwhelmed me. I think that fear was probably the main reason behind everything that happened. I felt a deep fear of myself, a constant fear of how everything would eventually work out, and how I would even function. there was a heavy fear of the future, and above all else, there was just this overwhelming fear about myself, fear of being alone, etc., and so on. And that somehow took me in a direction I shouldn't have gone. You know, it's like this. People are afraid of change. You enter life with some emotional baggage, with those patterns that were learned, which you then started to deepen yourself. Situations like, I don't want to be alone. I want to be with someone. I want to feel someone, to have someone by my side, a friend, friends, someone close, someone dear to your heart. The search for that, but along with that comes creating the image of a prince, let's say, on a white horse, who would arrive, present himself in the best possible way, set the bar high, and then all of that would just disappear somewhere. And what comes with that? Such relationships would fall apart very quickly at some point, and I would move on to the next one after another, without really learning anything from the previous one. It's not clear that at this point, such a person who appeared in my life, crossed my path, was also, in a way, absorbed by me mentally and emotionally. They would come out of it having lost a large part of themselves. Sometimes it happened that these people would reappear after some time. They would show up, or I happened to meet them again, and they were no longer the same. They were no longer the same because they had lost trust. They lost trust in people, and I was often the reason for that. Fear. Fear of everything. Fear that things could get better because I was afraid of what was to come. What was to come meant change. Stepping into new territory, into new experiences. Experiences I couldn't be sure of. So that constant sense of fear completely dominated most of my life. You know what comes with that? It's depression. I'm sure you've had moments when you didn't want to get up, you didn't see a reason to get up, there was no reason to live. There was no reason even to get up and eat something. There was no point. And waking up on a day like that, you ask yourself, why? What's the point of all this? It's not worth it anyway. Why should I even try? Why should I change anything? Why? So in order to change something, a person would reach for something, for another drink. They'd reach for another. Act as a substitute for themselves, let's call it that, for a kind of thing. False friend. And I personally believe that it is clear that each of you who has strayed somewhere along the way has met those friends personally, met them personally, and doesn't know how to deal with it. Because the truth is, in reality, we are all in this journey here together. Those who have lost their way are standing on the same level. Maybe we have different stories and backgrounds, but we share many common threads that bind us. You know what could be said? Here, fear also appeared, actually combined with anxiety. That feeling of that deep sense of emptiness, or more, that feeling of being lost, and so on. When you cannot see a clear goal ahead of you and feel like there is no future at all. those precious moments of happiness, even the fleeting ones that flickered into existence for only a very brief moment, were illusory, just superficial. They didn't bring much peace. They could for a moment, literally for just a brief split second, they might make me feel a little bit better. But ultimately those feelings would very quickly disappear simply because everything else in my life would come rushing back. Certainly one thing that is definitely worth mentioning here is the feeling of anger. That anger, bitterness, which also dominated. The fact that once again I failed, that once again I let someone down, that it was supposed to be different, but again I decided it would be otherwise. The fact that it filled me up. It is quite possible that it didn't show itself as the kind of typical aggression you might expect. But if you take a much closer look at the situation as psychological violence, well, here I could put it in first place. This form of manipulation and really forcing someone with your thinking and with your conversation into behaviors that a person shouldn't do to themselves. To accept the blame, to take the blame upon yourself. Because yes, it often happens. Something would occur. I did something stupid, yes, something I shouldn't have done. And here comes the attack. Here comes the attack towards this person, that I did it because you told me this way and not another. And that made me feel bad about it, and it's your fault. It was your behavior that led to this. Exactly. But in reality, the true foundation of all this was already deep within me. That solid foundation was built entirely on what I myself started to create once I had finally become an adult. As a child, I didn't have the chance to change it in any way. Later on, of course, but I was too much of a coward to fix it, to repair it, to somehow change my life for the better. Because why bother? Because that fear, that anxiety, that worry kept coming up all the time. Living like that, living such a shallow life, from today's perspective, a life that's worth nothing. But that was my decision, those were my choices, and that's how it was. You know, in this whole palette, in this range of emotions, you couldn't forget about or not mention jealousy. Jealousy of another person, jealousy of how someone feels, and so on. Because here it's not about material possessions, maybe not that kind of jealousy. I was never jealous that someone had it better, but rather that someone had a family, that someone had a partner, that someone felt happy. I was jealous of emotions that I never had them. Or maybe it's not that I never had them, they were there, but I couldn't express them. At that time I was only able to show the negative ones. And that's exactly what happened. You know, even though if you went back in time and looked at it from a distance, even if some positive emotions actually did appear, they were always somewhere deep underneath, completely hidden beneath the overwhelming bad ones. And here I am talking to you now about myself. Here I'm talking about myself, about how much I was able to degrade myself, how much I was able to not respect myself. I spent a lot of time wondering exactly how far a person could actually go, or more specifically, how far I could let myself fall before hitting the bottom. You know, that is often considered the best part of the journey. I vividly remember sitting through one of my many intense therapy sessions where I talked at great length about how I felt during those moments. I shift the blame, or put my guilt onto someone else. There were two people inside me. That Piotrek who did something wrong, who was to blame for everything and so on. And the other one? And as I was talking, I vividly remember a specific moment during one of my therapy sessions when I said, well, yeah, Piotrek definitely did something wrong and so on. And in my mind, it was clearly all his fault. But then my therapist looked at me and said, yes, that may be true, but you must realize that Piotrek and you are actually the exact same person. So in that moment, I had to learn in a very profound way how to truly take full responsibility for my own individual behavior. It was about no longer blaming someone else for my problems and not constantly pointing out that someone else had done something wrong in the past. He's the one at fault, not me. Trying to prove that he's the bad one, but not me. But the reality was completely different because the bad one was me. I just wasn't taking responsibility for it. And I think that's also where there was a kind of stone that needed to be dug out, something that was blocking the way for all of this. You know this path, it takes time. It takes time, and everyone has their own story. Here you've only heard a part of this story. In no way is this a form of self-pity or seeking applause, or looking for a pat on the back, someone to say, good job, we're proud of you, and so on and so on. You have to manage on your own. Many people around us have similar problems, but they're afraid to talk about it. They're afraid. Exactly, and again, fear, anxiety, and worry appear. Afraid of what? That someone will judge us, that someone will laugh at us. And here too, hate appears, which comes along with it. Hate that is everywhere around us. Hate that is spoken by people who actually have problems with themselves. And it was the same with me. It was easier for me to criticize someone, so to speak. Just to make fun of them. Sarcasm, so to speak. Expert level. Definitely going in that direction here. You look like this, you act like that. Because I kind of had a radar for good people. They were very susceptible to all kinds of comments, suggestions, and so on. And that also led to a distortion of their personalities because it left a wound and a scar on themselves. And that's how you could put it in a nutshell. There is much, much more to it. This is just a mere outline of how things really are. But I definitely know that today, after this several-year journey that I went through where I learned to take steps, I learned to change things that seemed impossible to change. But above all, this change concerned myself. And what caused that? Probably the fact that I reached out and asked for help. I realized on my own that I needed help because if I didn't do something about it, I wouldn't be here anymore. And that's actually where I was heading. Maybe I'll tell you about that next time. I think that it's worth fighting for yourself. I'm certain of that, and I'm living proof that no matter how hard it gets, for me, my story, the price I've paid and continue to pay for it is enormous. But each of you has a story like that. A similar one when it comes to the price you have to pay, the highest price, the price for yourselves. But I truly believe that each and every one of you has the fundamental right to change. You absolutely have that incredible possibility within you. If the thought ever appears in your mind that you want to change something for the better, just go ahead and do it. And that is probably the most important thing to keep in mind. Remember this one thing, each of you, and I as well, has the inherent right to experience true happiness, simply because I am happiness itself.